Hey everybody, welcome back to the Midwest MotoGirl podcast. If this is the first episode you're catching, welcome. I'm happy that you're here. If you're a returning listener, thank you, and I'm glad that you're enjoying or hopefully enjoying the show. This was my first full weekend home in over a month now between motorcycle racing, motorcycle track days, and travel for work, and I have to say, a weekend without motorcycles is kind of boring. I don't know how the average population does it, but lucky for you, if you're listening to the podcast, you're not part of the average population. You're probably a motorcycle rider. But even though it was a boring weekend, I did get caught up on some housework. I spent a little bit of time on some odds and ends with my ongoing home remodel, and I spent lots of time in the garage fixing my crashed race bike from last weekend. But none of that compares to all the fun and the excitement that comes along with actually getting to ride. Speaking of my crashed motorcycle, it's all put together now. It's all put back together now, with the exception of finishing up some safety wire and installing the windshield that is still in transit. So hopefully that windshield will be here on Tuesday. I think that's what the tracking said. And then it'll be all back together and ready for the next track day, which is in 2 weeks. Speaking of my crashed race bike, that leads me into the topic of today's podcast, crashing. We're going to dive into more details around crashing, including the mental side of crashing, managing risks associated with crashing, and potential causes of a crash. In one of my early podcast episodes, I talked about crashing my first motorcycle on the street when I was on a motorcycle trip with my dad down in Arkansas. In that scenario, I thought that I was prepared for the crash mentally, I thought that I was managing risk by wearing gear, and I thought that I was riding in a way to prevent crashing. But now that I know a lot more than I did back then, and I replay the incident a few times, I've realized that I was completely wrong in every single one of those areas. So at that time, I had a group of friends that I used to street ride with, and I was the only person in that group that hadn't crashed before, but I was also a brand new rider who only had a couple months of experience under my belt. But they used to share stories, and a lot of them ended up with crashing. And I guess that I kind of just assumed they were crashing because they had been riding recklessly, or they'd been doing something like stunting that caused the crash. And they did ride pretty fast on the street. Usually they were way faster than me and way above my abilities. So they would just ride at their speed, I would ride at mine, and then they would stop and wait for me so that we could meet up again. And a lot of them did ride wheelies and do stoppies and things like that on the street pretty regularly. So I just assumed all of those things combined were why they had crashed. I just assumed that I could avoid crashing if I took my time and if I was careful. And when I crashed down in Arkansas, I thought that I was being careful. But after I came home from that trip and word got around that I had crashed, almost every single one of my riding friends had told me the phrase that it's not if you crash, it's when you crash, which made sense at the time. And I was like, yeah, okay, I guess they're right. There's risks associated with riding a motorcycle. Crashing is one of those risks. And the more that I thought about it, the more I was like, okay, I know a lot of people that have been riding for a long amount of time, like my dad and my grandpa and my aunt and uncle, and they all had crashed at some point. I mean, they hadn't crashed recently, but they'd all crashed at some point, whether it was from an error on their part or something happened in traffic, a car hit them, whatever. And so I was like, yeah, that's probably right, that motorcycling is risky. It's not if you crash, but it's when you crash. And I think now I still believe that to be mostly true, but I think the context is a little bit different. We all know that there are risks associated with riding a motorcycle. I think we all know and understand that. There are risks associated with a lot of the things that we do every day. But due to the nature of a motorcycle, I think that the risks can be a little bit higher. And every time you get on your motorcycle, you're accepting the risks of riding that motorcycle. And I didn't think about riding a motorcycle that way when I first started out, and especially not when I had my crash in Arkansas. I was aware of the risks of riding, but I had not accepted that I could crash when we went on that trip or when we started out that day. I had not accepted in general that I could or would crash on a motorcycle. I just kept going back to this, if you're careful, you can avoid a crash. And when I did crash, I was upset, like rightfully so. I even cried. Some of the crying was probably out of like upset and disappointment and like adrenaline and all those things that I had just ruined our trip. I'd ruined the bike that I just had for a couple of months. And I was also crying because my hand was throbbing and I was bleeding because I had cheap gloves on that didn't do a very good job protecting me. So right there, I just kind of covered everything that I said we were going to talk about, where mentally I hadn't accepted the risk that I could crash. I hadn't mitigated the risks of a crash happening by wearing quality gear or by putting crash protection on my bike. And I had made multiple big errors while riding that caused the crash, such as not looking out in front of me far enough, not keeping my eyes up, turning the corner with the clutch pulled in, and object fixating on the gravel in the corner that I was trying to avoid. Fast forward to a little over 10 years from my first crash to my crash last week, where the circumstances were very different this time around. I crashed during a race at Brainerd International Raceway. So just right there, the circumstances are much different. I was on a racetrack with all my riding gear on versus on the street. But in this case, like, I don't know what I could have done differently to avoid the crash, because there weren't like any big glaring mistakes that I know that I was making that would have caused it. So I was riding really, really well when I crashed. And I was using my eyes, which is half the battle for me. I was coming out of turn 5, which is a fairly fast right-hand corner. And I was already past the apex of the corner. And I was on the gas. So I was wide open in 4th gear, say probably like 9,000 RPM. And I was like drifting out kind of like across the track like you normally would when you're coming out of a corner. Like you're using the whole track. But I still had the bike leaned over a little bit, and I did cross a bumpy patch on the track, and I was also like starting to transition from being leaned off the bike to being back in a neutral position on the bike. So I'm guessing that the combination of me transitioning back to being neutral while the bike was still leaned over a little bit and hitting that rough spot in the track were enough to upset the rear suspension, because I definitely felt the rear of the bike move, and I definitely felt the rear suspension unload. And when I felt the rear suspension unload, I kind of had an oh shit moment, because I thought that I was about to high side myself to the moon. But I stayed on the gas. I was really hoping that I could like possibly drive out of it. But when the rear suspension reloaded, it unloaded the front suspension, and then I lost traction on the front end, which resulted in a low side. And as I was actually crashing, I remember thinking to myself, oh shit, I'm crashing. Then I was sliding across the track and laying in the dirt. And like before I got up, I could feel the pressure in my race suit and kind of like in my chest. So I knew that my airbag had deployed, and that was kind of like my indicator, okay, like you're fine. And but like I did not feel anything when I hit the ground. So I know that my airbag deployed before I hit the ground. And then after I was kind of sitting there, then I was like, okay, now I can feel the pressure. But after I got up and I got to the wall and away from the track, one of the corner workers came over and he picked up the bike. He started talking to me to make sure that I was like okay and I was coherent. He was asking me questions about like where I was, what day it was, who the president was, things like that, basically to make sure that I like hadn't hit my head and like I knew where I was at. But then I started laughing and I could not stop smiling. And like, yes, I was a little disappointed that I crashed because I was riding really well and I was in 5th place in the featherweight race, which I was really excited about. There's a lot of really fast people at Brainerd on little bikes. And so being in 5th place at that point in the race, like that was better than what I had done probably the whole rest of the weekend. And so I was just like, gosh, dang it. Like I lost my position. Like I was going to get a PB that race. I was riding really well. And so like, that's kind of like where the disappointment came from. But I was not upset or disappointed or mad at all that I had crashed. I remember like thinking in my head, that was awesome. And it's weird, like, I guess to talk about the crash being awesome, but that's how I felt. And I'm sure that some of that was like adrenaline, but mentally I was prepared to crash. I knew that was a risk when I went out to race, and I was okay with that risk. And I've reminded myself of that risk many times during track days and racing. Up to this point, like I've been a little scared to crash because I don't want to get injured, but I've also come to terms that it could happen. And like I said, it's a part of racing. Like things happen, which is exactly where I was at after my crash. But I had also mitigated a lot of risks associated with crashing. So I mentioned my airbag. I wear a standalone airbag vest underneath my race suit. You can get a race suit with an airbag integrated in it. I have a standalone vest, and I decided on the standalone vest because I wanted to be able to wear it under my jacket if I was street riding or underneath my race suit if I was at the track. And if you're not familiar with like airbags or like an airbag vest, they're pretty common. They've been out for a few years now, but there's a sensor in the vest or in the airbag suit module part of it where if it sees a significant change in acceleration, it assumes that you're crashing and it deploys the airbag. So mine went off before I hit the ground as it should have, and I'm very thankful that it did because after I landed, I was a little bit confused about like how I had landed and like how I had rolled because I was basically chest side down towards the ground when the front end washed out from under me. But when I stopped sliding, I was on my back. So I knew that I had like tumbled or like turned over somehow, but I wasn't exactly sure how. And it wasn't until like the next day where my right shoulder was really sore that I kind of figured out, oh, when I went off the bike face forward, I landed on my shoulder and my right arm, and then I rolled over onto my back and went sliding. Basically, of this crash, like at say 60, 65 mile an hour, just based off like what gear and RPM that I was in, of that crash, like my biggest injury were 2 bruised fingers and a small bruise on each one of my legs. And I credit a lot of that to my airbag. Like I said, it deployed before I hit the ground. I didn't feel it when I hit the ground at all. But had I not have that on, I may have dislocated my shoulder. I could have broke my arm. Maybe like broke ribs. Like you never know. Anything could happen. But like I said, 60 or 65 mile an hour crash, I got up, walked away, no injuries. And like, to me, that's just crazy. Like, I don't think that I will ever ride without an airbag again because I saw it do its job and it worked. And this is just my opinion, but if you are riding at the track without an airbag, like, please consider getting one. This is probably like the biggest thing that you can do to mitigate risk when it comes to safety around like track riding or crashing in general. And if you're not riding at the track, you're not racing, you're just street riding, like still also consider it. Or if you're just street riding in general and you don't want to like invest in the airbag vest or some kind of like airbag suit, just please wear gear and like wear quality gear. I mentioned that I hurt my hand in my first crash on the street, but I had like the cheapest, crappiest gloves on, and those gloves just ripped right in half. And so like there's a purpose to good quality gear, and it will protect you in the event of an accident. Another way that I mitigated risk with my crash, like as far as like mechanically, is that my bike has case savers or case covers. And so after the crash, the corner worker picked up the bike, he got it over to the wall. As I was standing there with him, we looked over the bike really quickly, and he checked in the belly pan to like make sure there were no fluids. The belly pan was dry. There were no fluids. There was no oil lost. After the race was done, a couple of guys from my pit, they went and got it from out next to the wall off the track. And like I had broken the clip-on off, so like the controls and stuff were just hanging, but they were able to ride it back to our pit. Like there's nothing like mechanically wrong with the bike after that crash. And like it's mostly cosmetic damage, but the reason I say that I was able to mitigate risk by like preparing my bike with case covers is because those case covers are designed to protect your engine in the event that it's sliding across the asphalt or the concrete. So my case covers are aluminum, and so like it slid on the aluminum slider rather than sliding on an engine cover and wearing a hole through the side of the engine cover. So it didn't drop any fluids on the track. It didn't create a hazard for any other riders. My bike didn't lose any oil. It's mechanically sound to ride. I wish that I would have had those case covers or case sliders on my first crash, because my day could have looked significantly different. In my first crash on the street, my bike slid into a curb, and as it slid across the ground, I wore a hole in the side of the engine cover. It dumped oil all over the highway, and I had to leave my bike along the highway while I rode on the back of my dad's bike an hour and a half back to our hotel to get a trailer to come and pick it up. And by the time we got back to where I had crashed, my bike was gone. And then we spent like the rest of the night on a wild goose chase trying to figure out where my bike was at, who had picked it up, what impound lot it was at, just on and on and on, because I didn't have any crash protection. So crash protection, it's a great thing, whether you're at the track or if you're on the street. And I don't care if you are street riding or track riding. Like, I think that it's really important for everybody to have the correct mindset around crashing. So, like, obviously you're not going to be out there trying to crash, and it's not something that you want to happen, but it is a risk associated with riding your motorcycle. And if you haven't come to terms with that risk, when it happens, you're going to probably have a pretty poor experience. Maybe it's a little weird that I'm talking about crashing in this sense, but I think that like it's a real thing, and it's like a different way that you have to think about risk with your bike, and you have to like accept and come to terms with those risks. So at the last track day that I was at, towards the end of June, there were a handful of crashes that day. And there were two people who crashed that had very opposite outlooks or experiences, like when the crash happened and like after the fact. And so like they both made some significant errors in their riding that ultimately led to the crash. But one had accepted that crashing was a risk and the other hadn't. And their experiences after the fact and their mindset after the fact were like very, very different. So the person who hadn't accepted that crashing could happen and they hadn't accepted that as a risk was really upset when the crash happened and after it happened, and like it just definitely ruined the vibe for everybody around. Whereas the person who had accepted crashing was a risk, they ended up going to the hospital with a leg injury, and then they came back to the track afterwards, and they were talking about how they wanted to come back the next month, assuming their injury was all healed up. And they were like, yeah, like that was awesome. Again, if you haven't accepted that you could crash when you go out to ride, that ride could, or like that crash could upset you or your confidence so much that you don't want to ride anymore. And like I said, I already told you how boring a weekend without riding motorcycles is. So like I promise, like that's not where you want to end up. Another thing to keep in mind on kind of like the mindset and like the mental aspect of crashing is the adrenaline rush and the adrenaline dump that you're going to get from a crash. So when you first crash, obviously you have adrenaline running through your body. During my first crash, the adrenaline had me wanting to pick up my bike off the ground before I had even examined myself to see if I was injured. And like the adrenaline of my crash last week, it had me laughing and smiling and saying like that was awesome. But the reason that it's important to remember that you're going to have that adrenaline rush is because the adrenaline may overpower an injury caused by your crash. So it's important to take like just a few extra seconds to make sure that you've examined yourself and that you like legitimately are okay before you just jump up and try checking on your bike or like whatever it is. And I also mentioned the adrenaline dump because some people may experience adrenaline differently when it wears off. So in my first crash, when the adrenaline wore off, I felt pain because my hand was injured. And I also started crying because I had just ruined my bike. And in my crash last week, when the adrenaline wore off, I kind of got tired and I just like needed to sit down for a couple of minutes, like take a few deep breaths and like kind of relax. At the last track day, one of the people who crashed had never experienced an adrenaline rush or an adrenaline dump before. So when the adrenaline wore off, they were upset and crying, but then they also said that they felt sick. And so, like, everyone experiences adrenaline a little bit differently, but I think it's just important to be aware that when the adrenaline wears off, you may experience a lot of emotions. And depending on where you're at or who you're with, you need to figure out how to control those emotions. So maybe your adrenaline wears off and you need to cry. That's fine. Like, that happens. But go take a walk, get it out, and then gather yourself and and shake it off. There's no need or reason to just dwell on those emotions when the adrenaline wears off. Like, let it all out and then gather yourself and come back and be like, okay, I'm ready to accept that this happened now. So we've talked about getting into the correct mental state where you've accepted and are okay with the risks associated with riding a motorcycle. One of those risks being crashing. Obviously, that's what the whole episode has been about. But we've also talked about mitigating some of the risks if you do crash. And this can be in the form of wearing quality safety gear so that you're mitigating the risk of injury. It can also be in the form of bike preparation, even bike maintenance. And I will get into bike maintenance more in a different episode, but knowing that your bike has been maintained properly and is in good working order before you go out for a ride is a top way that you can mitigate risk of a crash occurring. So let's talk about some of the errors or mistakes that can lead to a crash. I just mentioned bike maintenance, or in this case, lack of bike maintenance. So if your bike has not been maintained properly and has a mechanical issue that you don't know about or don't address before you go out to ride, you could be putting yourself at risk of crashing. Think about if you have a bad fork seal. So that seal is leaking. It's leaking oil down the front fork and onto your wheel. Pretty soon that oil gets onto your tire and you could experience loss of traction, resulting in a crash. Oil is slippery. You don't want oil on your tires. Maybe your bikes haven't been maintained properly and you use the ability to brake adequately while you're riding. Maybe you haven't been inspecting your bike, so you don't notice that you have a damaged or a dry rotted radiator hose that ends up blowing while you're riding. Now you're leaking coolant all over, which ends up getting in your tire. Coolant is slippery, causes loss of traction. The list goes on and on. Your eyes are another big one that can cause a crash. And I think there's 3 big parts that go along with your eyes. So one of the things is that you want to keep your eyes up. Part of it is that you should be scanning with your eyes and looking where you want to go. And then another big thing or big error with your eyes is object fixation. So one of the things that they teach you in a new rider's course is to scan back and forth with your eyes. And if you're not scanning back and forth with your eyes, that can cause you to end up like looking at the ground, or you're just like barely looking right out in front of where you're going. So you're missing something farther ahead that's a hazard. Or maybe you are not looking up, which also means that you're not looking where you want to go. So you're not looking through the corner, and then you don't see a corner, you don't see a hazard at that corner. Or maybe you just overshoot the corner, and if you're on a highway or something, you come into oncoming traffic. So that's a big risk. And the reason like looking where you want to go and looking through the corner is really important is because your bike is going to follow wherever your head is pointed. So if you are looking through a corner, say you're making a right-hand corner, you turn your head to the right, your bike is automatically going to follow that way. And with object fixation, that's where you are focusing on something that you want to avoid, which causes you to drive right into whatever that object was. So learning out how to use your eyes, including like keeping your eyes up, scanning, and looking where you want to go, or looking through the corner, like it takes practice. And sometimes you have to consciously tell yourself to use your eyes, basically to get that connection working between your eyes and your brain. And object fixation can be a really big challenge, especially for new riders when you're riding a motorcycle. But the more familiar that you are with what object fixation is and the causes of it or what can happen if you're object fixation, the more you can make a conscious effort to avoid it and not do it. If you aren't familiar with how to use your eyes or object fixation, how to avoid it, please do some additional research and go learn about those things. I am not a riding instructor. I do talk about a lot of knowledge that I have from riding a motorcycle for 11 years now and my experiences, but there are tons of riding instructors who are qualified to teach you and tell you about that. A lot of them have YouTube videos out there. Some of them have podcasts. Ken Hill is one that I like to watch on YouTube and listen to his podcasts. He's an ex-racer. He teaches people how to ride and does like coaching for a living. So he's very, very qualified. But like I said, there's tons of other riding instructors out there on the internet, or maybe even coaching at your local safety council. So please check them out. Listen to what they have to say, because ultimately your riding depends on being able to use your eyes and use them effectively. Poor situational awareness is another thing that can potentially lead to a crash. And when I say poor situational awareness, this could be any combination of lots of different critical errors or things going on in your environment. So you're not anticipating what could be happening with traffic. Maybe you're not anticipating what could be happening with road conditions. And so in a situation like that, maybe you're riding along, you're watching the car in front of you, but you're not looking past that car in front of you to see that there's an accident and there's going to be a traffic jam. So you need to be prepared that something is coming up that you should be slowing down for. And when you have poor situational awareness while you're riding your motorcycle, things can sneak up very quickly, and then those can cause you to make other critical errors. It can put you in, say, like a panic mode type of situation. I would say poor situational awareness is something that is within your control to help you avoid a crash. Overconfidence is another thing that can cause crashing. And when I say overconfidence, that's where you're pushing beyond your skill level. Maybe you're riding more aggressively than you can or than you should be. I would say a lot of crashes on the racetrack, they come from overconfidence, where somebody is riding above their ability to try and hit a certain lap time, or they're riding above their ability to try and stay in a certain position in a race, to finish better, to catch the person in front of them. And there is some of that you need to do to become a faster rider on the racetrack, but just blatantly riding above your skill level, it's going to cause crashes. And in the case of my crash last week, I don't think that it was an overconfidence thing. I mean, yes, I was riding well. Yes, I did feel very confident in my abilities, but I didn't feel like I was taking a lot of risk. I didn't feel like I was riding at the edge of my abilities when I crashed. I definitely think that most of it had to do with a combination of factors of the inputs that I was putting into the bike and the track conditions that caused my crash. But even on the street, overconfidence or risk-taking is going to lead to a crash. I mean, think about the people that are, say, riding wheelies. And they're confident, they're riding a wheelie, and they go a little bit too far. Well, now they're 12 o'clock on their back in the street. Or think about the people that they're racing around, and they're not thinking about, say, the potential gravel that's in a corner, and they take a corner too fast, they hit the gravel, and there they just lost traction and they're done. So overconfidence and risk-taking are definitely something that can lead to crashing, but again, those things are within your control. Improper braking is also something that could lead you to a crash. In that example with the situational awareness, where something came up quicker, you were in a panic mode, you just grab a handful of front brake. But it causes like a loss of control with your motorcycle. A lot of riding instructors that I've listened to, they talk about braking being one of the most important skills that you can learn on a motorcycle behind learning how to use your eyes. And that's because there are so many different inputs that you can put into your suspension with braking. So learning how to be effective with your brakes and learning how to trail brake and these different braking techniques, like all of that is going to help you be a better rider and help you to avoid a crash. And again, I am not a riding instructor. I am not here to teach you or tell you about all the different braking techniques that you could learn, because some of those I'm still working on and trying to master myself. Trail braking is one of them. I find trail braking to be a little bit scary and kind of difficult. And so it's something that I'm practicing on and getting more comfortable with every single race. Again, there are tons of riding instructors out there that have techniques and videos that you can try. You can watch the videos, try their techniques, practice the drills to become more effective with your braking. And there are also lots of like advanced motorcycle riding courses and clinics out there that you can take. And I have not personally taken one. I've done a race school. I've done a track school. When I first was started out riding, I took the motorcycle safety course for basic motorcycle operation and riding, but I have not taken like an advanced street rider course. But I'm sure that in one of those courses, they probably cover braking and they probably cover some braking techniques. So if you go and take that course, don't come for me if they don't talk about braking, but I can't imagine that an advanced rider's course would not cover something like that. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up today's episode. So I hope that this was informative and helped you be more aware about crashing. If you are enjoying the podcast or you want to get updates when new episodes are released, please hit that follow button. You can also follow me on social media. My Instagram is midwest.motogirl, just like the name of the podcast. Or my racing page on Facebook is Sydney, SYDNEY, Guard, GARD, Racing. Again, that's Sydney Guard Racing on Facebook. So let's keep it on two wheels, and we will catch you guys next time.